I have gathered a truly massive collection of these flesh-eating monsters just for you. In return, I only humbly ask that you leave a lasting scar on that like button for the rest of its life. According to Lunacy 24, veteran rangers have a silent rule, a single word and a specific subject that they refuse to utter aloud. And when he finally understood the reason why, he wished he had never asked. Hello everyone, I am the man who goes by that alias. My real name is David Vance, and this year I have just turned 38. At this very moment, I am recounting this story from inside my apartment, where every door is securely double locked and the curtains are always drawn tight to prevent even a narrow sliver of light from entering. I cannot bear the thought of something staring at me from out of the darkness, a primal fear that has burrowed deep into the marrow of my bones. My mind begins to drift back into the past, unearthing the most terrible mistake of my life exactly 10 years ago. Back then, with the impulsiveness and arrogance of youth, I eagerly applied for a job at the Superior National Forest Ranger Station. It was a remote and deep wilderness, the very place where my biological brother, Michael, who is currently 42 years old, was serving as the deputy chief of the station. If I had known then what kind of malevolent entity that forest was hiding beneath its dense canopy, if I had known that my curiosity would be paid for in blood and a psychological trauma that could never be healed, I would have stayed away from that place forever. Superior National Forest possesses a breathtaking beauty, yet it is suffocatingly oppressive, with countless black spruce trees towering high to blot out the sky, creating a natural prison for anyone who enters. At this small ranger station tucked away in the heart of the great woods, I began to get acquainted with new colleagues besides my brother. The station chief was Leonard, a man in his 60s with wrinkled skin that bore the deep marks of exhaustion and eyes that always held an invisible anxiety. Next was Elias, a seasoned ranger who was extremely taciturn and morose, a man who always seemed to be shying away from the shadows cast behind the ancient trees. The only female member of the team was Sarah, a 45-year-old woman who was incredibly tough, cold, and always worked with intense focus. From the very first weeks, I quickly noticed the strange atmosphere hanging over the entire station and their highly unusual daily habits. Not a single one of them would ever whistle, even during their most relaxed moments of rest, and there was an unwritten law that everyone strictly followed, never to go on patrol alone after the sun had set. Whenever I questioned these odd rules, everyone would avoid my gaze and bury themselves in their work. This left me with a deep skepticism, believing they were merely obsessed with the silly folk legends of this desolate mountain region, unaware that those rules were paid for with the lives of those who came before. My youthful skepticism was soon crushed into fragments during my very first patrol with Elias. It was a stifling late summer afternoon, and we were assigned to check a remote area deep within the core of the spruce forest. Everything initially proceeded quite normally with the familiar, noisy symphony of the wild. I could clearly hear the woodpeckers drumming their beaks against dry trunks, the rustling of small animals scurrying under the fallen leaves, and the endless hum of tens of thousands of insects hidden in the dense thickets. Then, in a brief heartbeat, every sound in the forest was suddenly sucked away, as if a giant hand had just flipped the sound switch for the entire world. Not a bird chirped, not an insect called, and even the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves vanished completely, giving way to a deathly silence so still it made my ears throb with pain. The surrounding air suddenly turned thick, heavy, and chillingly cold. I intended to ask Elias what strange weather pressure phenomenon was occurring, but my self-satisfaction instantly froze when I looked over at the veteran ranger. His weather-beaten face was now as pale as a ghost, great beads of sweat soaked his forehead, and his eyes were wide with a state of utter panic. Without giving me time to react, Elias lunged forward and grabbed my arm with a force so strong it felt like it could break bone, then he pulled me into a desperate run through the thorny brush toward the trail. While I was still staggering to keep up with his frantic, headlong pace, Elias kept turning his head to look back behind the towering black trees. He muttered broken words through his heavy gasps, saying that when the forest goes silent, you have exactly 10 minutes to leave. His hands trembled violently, and it was the primal fear radiating from a man who had spent over 30 years living in the deep woods that caused an unexplainable chill to run down my spine for the first time. sparking a horrific premonition that something invisible and incredibly hungry was slowly watching our every retreating step. Returning to the station after that terrifying patrol, my heart rate had still not returned to normal, yet my curiosity and youthful competitive nature quickly overrode the afternoon fear. That evening, the whole team gathered for dinner in the common dining hall, a space that was usually familiar but now felt unusually stifling. Under the dim yellow light, I decided to break the stillness by vividly recounting the strange phenomenon in the forest and questioned Elias about his excessive panic and the nonsensical 10-minute rule. Immediately, the clinking of cutlery against dishes fell silent. Everyone from Chief Leonard and Sarah to Elias stopped what they were doing at once. Shadows seemed to flood the room, causing the air to freeze in an instant. No one bothered to look at me, their eyes were glued to the tabletop with extreme tension. Before I could open my mouth to ask a second question, my brother Michael stood up abruptly, his face gray and his jaw clenched in anger. He roughly grabbed my arm and dragged me out into the dark, cold yard behind the station despite my struggling protests. Under the faint darkness, Michael hissed every word through gritted teeth, forbidding me from ever mentioning that silence or asking any questions about the station's silent rules ever again. The anger mixed with sheer terror in his eyes made me shiver momentarily, but the oversized ego of a 28-year-old man filled with rigid scientific theories quickly clouded everything. I sneered inwardly, angrily brushed his hand away, and walked away, convinced that these rangers who had worked for years in these sacred woods were ultimately just faint-hearted people infected by cheap superstition, never knowing that I was stripping away my own last chance at survival. Only a few days after the night I arrogantly dismissed my brother's warnings, a cruel reality dealt me a fatal blow that began to crack the scientific theories I so worshipped. That day, Michael and I were assigned to patrol along the edge of the lake. The atmosphere between us was still heavy with the tension from our previous argument, so we hardly spoke a word to each other. The smell of decay hit our nostrils before either of us could see what had created it. Not far from the trail, Michael suddenly stopped, his eyes fixed on a thin branch high above, about 6 meters from the ground. I looked up and my stomach immediately turned as I discovered a deer carcass caught up there. The blood of the unfortunate animal was still dripping in thick droplets, staining the patch of leaves below. Using the knowledge I had learned, I tried to analyze the situation, but my brain was completely helpless before what was being revealed. That branch was too small and weak to support the weight of a black bear or a mountain lion dragging prey, and furthermore, no ordinary predator has the habit of hanging its prey at such an absurd height. As I stepped closer to observe, I realized with horror that the carcass had no typical bite marks from fangs. The entire flesh and skin of the deer had been torn away in jagged, broken patches, exactly as if a giant, hideous hand with razor-sharp claws had brutally seized the animal and shredded it with a purely malicious strength. I stood frozen in place, trying to swallow hard to push back the nausea rising in my throat, while beside me, Michael's face turned hard and pale. His eyes held a look of desperate resignation, as if he had seen this horrific sight somewhere in the past. Immediately after witnessing the horror of the shredded deer carcass hanging from the high branch, Michael, with trembling hands, grabbed his radio to report the emergency to the main station. From the other end, Chief Leonard's usually calm voice was now hoarse and as tight as a wire as he formally declared Code Yellow over the entire Superior National Forest area. I had never heard of this code in any training manual, but immediately, a series of unprecedentedly strict defense regulations were established, in which every ranger was absolutely forbidden from patrolling alone and was required to carry a rifle loaded with ammunition instead of just the standard handgun on their hip. The overwhelming confusion combined with the evasive attitude of my colleagues pushed my curiosity to its peak, urging me to find the answers to the mysteries hidden in these remote mountains. During the middle of the night, while the whole station was in a labored sleep, I stealthily broke into the old record room located at the end of the hallway to search for clues. Under the weak light of a small flashlight, I frantically rummaged through the rusted filing cabinets until I found a yellowed file labeled 1979 that had been tucked away in a hidden corner. What made my skin crawl was that most of the pages inside were either jaggedly torn or heavily blacked out with thick ink to hide the terrible truths. However, through the sparse lines that remained and had not yet been erased, I read with a shudder the scattered reports of a series of mysterious disappearances and gruesome deaths where the bodies were shredded in the same illogical manner as the deer from earlier. The air in the record room suddenly turned freezing, and deep in my mind, I began to vaguely realize that what was roaming out there was not a creature of the natural world, but an ancient nightmare that had once risen to spread death to this very ranger station decades ago. The terrifying premonitions from that yellowed file from 1979 quickly turned into a bloody reality just a few days later when the station radio received a broken call from a fisherman in a state of utter panic. He stammered a report about discovering something that looked like a human corpse lying alone on a small, remote rocky island in Lake Disappointment. Chief Leonard immediately sent Michael and me to investigate the scene under the harsh sun of a late summer afternoon. As soon as the bow of the boat touched the jagged rocky shore, the pungent stench of rot hit our noses, causing my stomach to cramp. Then, our eyes were met by a sight that will haunt me until the day I close them forever. It was the body of a male tourist in his early 30s, or rather, what was left of him, lying on his back in a patch of withered grass. Unlike the body of my late grandfather lying peacefully in a coffin that I had seen before, this man's face was twisted in an expression of extreme horror, his eyes staring blankly up at the sky. The victim's entire lower body and chest had suffered catastrophic injuries, with large chunks of flesh torn away in an incredibly brutal, jagged manner, exactly like the wounds on the deer carcass. The fortified psychological wall I had built with rigid forestry theories collapsed instantly, replaced by a psychological shock that struck my brain, making my knees weak, cold sweat soak my shirt, and my breathing become suffocatingly rapid. While I stood frozen, trying to swallow the bile rising in my throat, Michael, with a gray face and hands tightly gripping his rifle, began to cautiously check the surroundings. The evidence left at the scene only added to the horror, as long trails of blood and numerous red handprints on the jagged rocks showed that the victim had not died immediately but had desperately used his last bit of strength to crawl toward the water's edge for a chance at survival. However, deep scratches plowing into the ground in the opposite direction proved that the demon hiding in the shadows had not let him go. It had brutally seized its prey and dragged him backward into the deep night of the forest to continue its barbaric slaughter. After reporting the situation over the radio, we received orders to camp on the spot to guard the body and wait for the forensic team from the center to arrive early the next morning. Darkness fell over Lake Disappointment so fast it felt as if someone had just draped a giant, rough black blanket over the entire forest, swallowing the last flickering rays of a blood-red sunset. The night brought a bone-chilling cold that mingled with the smell of death lingering in the air, making me shiver uncontrollably despite wearing a thick jacket. My brother and I huddled in the corner of a large rock outcropping, not daring to light a fire for fear the light would attract the demon lurking out there. We could only hold on to the cold rifle stocks and strain our ears for the slightest sound. Time passed slowly and agonizingly until about midnight, when, amidst the suffocating silence of the mountains, a bizarre sound suddenly tore through the night. It was the sobbing of a man echoing from the dense woods on the other side of the lake, sounding incredibly mournful and pathetic, yet carrying a hollow tone that was spine-chilling. At first, my instinct as a rescue worker urged me to grab the high-power flashlight and shine it toward the sound to find the victim, but Michael was as quick as lightning, pinning my arm down to the gravel with terrifying force. In the pale light of the waning crescent moon, I was shocked to see my brother's face distorted in extreme terror. His teeth were chattering uncontrollably while his hands shook as he pointed the rifle toward the pitch-black night covering the water. That pathetic crying did not stay in one place but began to move along the muddy edge at an impossibly fast speed. In just a few blinks, the sound had traveled a vast distance as if whatever was making the noise was gliding rather than running on human feet. Michael's rough hand hurried to cover my mouth, his sweat dripping onto my face as he leaned close to whisper desperately that I must not make a sound, was strictly forbidden from turning on the light, and most importantly, must never answer that lying voice if I did not want to become the next pile of shredded meat on this haunted island. The next morning, when the forensic team and armed police arrived by boat to take over the bloody scene, the pale dawn rose to somewhat dissipate the suffocation of the dark night, but it was completely helpless in clearing the darkness swallowing my mind. As soon as we returned to the station and were alone in the cramped space of the break room, I immediately locked the door and cast aside all my long-held restraint to corner Michael and question him to the end about the dirty secrets being hidden. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes and gathered all my courage to utter the forbidden words starting with W that I had secretly read in that torn file from 1979, the word Wendigo. The moment he heard that name leave my mouth, Michael's face turned as white as a corpse. He lunged forward and slapped me with a thunderous blow, then desperately clutched his own face, which was twitching with fear. In his eyes, there was no longer the hardened authority of a deputy chief, but only total breakdown as he slumped onto the edge of the worn bed and began to sob, recounting the truth about the tragedy of 1979 that their predecessors had used blood and silence to buy a fake peace. He spoke in a faint, broken voice, saying that the malevolent entity is always hungry and that anyone foolish enough to mention its name is like lighting a brilliant lighthouse in a dark sea. It will hear it instantly, smell our presence, and it will come to discard all boundaries and hunt those who dared to call its name. Michael pleaded with me, gripping my shoulders, begging me to bury that damn curiosity in a deep grave, to act as if I had never heard anything, and preferably to apply for a transfer elsewhere as soon as possible because humans absolutely cannot fight an ancient nightmare that existed before we were even born. However, my stubbornness and massive psychological defense wall once again rose up in blind rebellion. Despite having seen the illogically shredded body with my own eyes and hearing the hollow, ghostly voice moving at impossible speeds the night before, I still stubbornly clung to broken scientific reasoning to delude myself. I argued harshly with Michael, resolutely defending my view that all these barbaric events were surely the work of a psychotic serial killer hiding in the dense forest or, at most, a gene-mutated predator. I firmly refused to believe in the indigenous devil legends, never knowing that my arrogant insolence was slowly opening the gates of hell for our entire team. After that heated and stalemated argument with my brother, a whole month passed in an incredible silence that managed to deceive even our most alert senses. The forest seemed to have returned to its natural rhythm, with birds singing at dawn and leaves rustling peacefully under the cool early autumn winds. There were no more shredded animal carcasses hanging from high branches, no more hollow sobbing echoing from the edge of Lake Disappointment, and although Code Yellow was still in effect, everyone began to unconsciously relax. The lines of tension on Chief Leonard's forehead seemed to soften, while Michael gradually stopped jumping at the sound of every snapping dry branch outside his bedroom window. For my part, this false peace only reinforced my senseless ego, making me smugly think that the psychotic killer or mutated beast had likely been spooked by the police activity and had moved on to another area. We almost believed the worst nightmare was over, never imagining it was just the deathly lull before the storm, a perfect trap set by an incredibly patient and cunning hunter. Our illusion of safety shattered into thousands of sharp pieces on a gray afternoon when the old radio system in the duty room suddenly emitted ear-piercing static. Through the layers of noise was a panicked, broken distress signal from two tourists who were screaming that they were completely lost and trapped deep inside the forbidden, extremely dangerous core of the black spruce forest. Their voices were trembling and distorted by sobs and desperate gasps, reporting a freak, thick fog slowly swallowing them and a bone-chilling sensation that a tall, spindly black shadow was quietly moving around their campsite, completely blocking all exits. As soon as the distress signal on the radio cut out, leaving only the soulless hiss of radio waves, a deathly silence immediately enveloped the duty room before Chief Leonard slammed his hand on the table and ordered us to move out. Without a second's hesitation, I, along with Michael and the veteran ranger Sarah, put on our protective gear, equipped ourselves with loaded weapons, and hooked coils of sturdy rope to our waists to form a rapid response team, heading straight into the forbidden core of the black spruce woods. The deeper we went into the cordoned-off area, the more the surrounding vegetation seemed to transform into something bizarre. Ancient, gnarled trees intertwined to form a giant prison dome that completely hid the pale rays of the late afternoon sun. After just over an hour of difficult trekking through thorny brush, a pungent stench of rotting meat began to waft from under the layer of decaying leaves, hitting my brain and causing my stomach to cramp with uncontrollable nausea. At the same time, the space around us began to grow distorted and dark as a thick, ash-gray fog of unknown origin rolled in, swallowing every tree and blade of grass despite it being the dry days of early autumn. This stifling, unseasonal fog radiated a bone-chilling cold that blurred our vision and erased the boundary between sky and earth, as if the three of us had just stepped across an invisible line into a haunted dimension separate from reality. While I was still confused, holding my hand out in front of me but barely able to see my own fingers, Sarah's choked, panicked voice rang out right beside me, making me jump. She held the magnetic compass up to her eyes with trembling hands, and both Michael and I felt our skin crawl as we watched the needle inside spinning wildly in endless, meaningless circles, officially signaling the cruel truth that we were completely lost and isolated in the hunting grounds of that bloodthirsty creature. Leaving behind the horror of the useless compass, we were forced to rely on instinct and hearing to continue fumbling through the fog. About 20 minutes passed in intense silence before we stumbled upon a clearing where the silhouette of the campsite set up by the two unfortunate tourists faintly appeared. However, the scene before us was nothing but a haunting ruin, with two canvas tents shredded into ribbons, their bent aluminum frames lying across a muddy puddle mixed with the faint scent of blood in the air. There was absolutely no one there, no moans or any signs of survival, only a spine-chilling silence. While frantically searching the ruins for any clue, the toe of my boot accidentally struck a cold metal object lying under a torn tarp. It was a small handheld voice recorder with a weak red indicator light still blinking, proving it had just been used not long ago. Michael snatched the device from my hand and pressed play on the final recording with muddy, trembling hands. From the tiny, tinny speaker, instead of the desperate pleas for help we expected, there came a thick, wheezing, wet sound, exactly like the breathing of a creature being smothered or having thick liquid gurgling up its throat. And then, following that horrific breathing, a voice spoke, calling out the companion's name. The terrifying part was that the voice perfectly mimicked every tone and panicked rhythm of one of the two tourists we had heard on the radio, yet it carried a hollow, soulless, and cold resonance that left us frozen. Cold sweat poured down as we realized the demon stalking us did not just seize its prey with claws, but knew how to steal their voices to set a perfect psychological trap. Before the horror from the recording could settle, nature seemed to join the demon in driving us toward a desperate dead end. The gray sky above suddenly burst open, pouring down a violent storm unlike any I had ever seen, with raindrops as large and cold as ice needles stinging our faces. The wind shrieked mournfully through the twisted spruce trees, pulling the thick fog into violent swirls that turned our already limited vision pitch black. Sarah screamed over the thunder that we could not retreat to the station in such extreme weather while being completely lost. Michael gritted his teeth, scanned the white sheet of rain, and signaled us to run toward a nearby rocky ledge where an old, abandoned maintenance cabin stood. We used our last bit of strength to burst inside and immediately shoved a rickety desk and a rusted iron cabinet against the main door. The interior was damp and smelled of green moss and rotting wood, but it offered a thin shield against the howling storm. However, that small sense of safety did not last long as a massive, pitch-black night fell, swallowing everything. At that moment, a horrific phenomenon occurred, exactly like my first patrol with Elias. The sound of the rain lashing the tin roof, the wind whistling through the cracks, and even the growling thunder outside suddenly faded and was suppressed in an illogical way. A deathly, suffocating silence once again filled every space in the wooden house, drowning out all the sounds of the violent storm, signaling that we had officially become prey locked in a cramped cage, with the hunter prowling just outside the thin walls. The suffocating silence inside the cabin lasted only a short while before it was torn apart by a very strange sound right outside the rotted wooden door we had just braced. At first, it was just a faint clicking, like something sharp tapping against the wood, and then it turned into slow knocks in a steady, calculated rhythm of 3 at a time. The dry, echoing knocks in the dead space felt like a cruel taunt, as if whatever was outside was fully aware of the terror coursing through our veins. My heart felt like it would leap out of my chest as every knock matched the horrific thumping in my own ribs, while Michael and Sarah backed away against the rear wall, their hands gripping their gun stocks until their knuckles were white. When the final 3 knocks stopped, another spine-chilling sound began from above our heads, the sound of sharp claws scraping and pulling hard against the rusted tin roof, creating a screeching sound like metal being brutally torn. It was moving on the roof, hovering right over us with heavy, powerful steps that caused sawdust and dry moss to fall from the ceiling. Unable to bear this psychological torture for another second, I swallowed hard and risked crawling toward a dusty, spiderwebbed window to peek through a narrow crack in the clouded glass. Through the swirling gray fog and the flickering light of distant lightning, I saw a sight that will forever haunt my dreams. A massive, tall, spindly black shadow with long, deformed limbs was silently moving around the cabin. Its skin was as pale as a drowned corpse, mottled with mud, and most horrifyingly, that great entity was not walking on two legs like a human, but was crawling leisurely on all four limbs with a twisted, distorted posture that defied every biological law. The moment the loathsome image of that deformed creature entered my sight, I scrambled backward and fell onto the dusty floor with a terror that throttled my lungs. I opened my mouth to scream a warning, but my throat was completely frozen. Just as the panic reached its peak, the scraping of claws on the roof stopped, replaced by a brief but heavy silence. And then, from right outside the thin main door, a voice suddenly rose through the drizzling rain, shattering the stillness inside. My heart stopped completely and the blood in my veins froze when I realized with horror that it was exactly the familiar, warm voice of my brother. That voice called my name weakly, mournfully, and desperately, pleading for me to open the door because he was cold, his body was broken, and he was bleeding from a deep wound. Every word carried the broken breath and genuine panic that twisted my mind, sparking a blind urge to rush out and tear down every barrier to save my brother. However, a brutal reality hit me like a blow when I turned my head and realized Michael was still huddling in the dark corner just a few steps away. Under the pale light of distant lightning, my brother's face was as white as a corpse, his eyes wide and vacant with despair, while his teeth bit into his lower lip until dark red blood flowed to keep himself from sobbing. The large, rough hands of a normally brave deputy chief were now trembling violently as he gripped his rifle, aiming it at the closed door as if pointing a weapon at his own ghost. I realized then the sick psychological game of the thing outside. It didn't just want to tear us apart for hunger, it wanted to eat our sanity, using our love and a perfect, lying voice to lure us into surrendering ourselves to death. The cruel game ended as abruptly as it began when the fake pleading voice of Michael outside suddenly cut off, replaced by a low, deep growl that shook the muddy ground. In the moment our nerves were stretched to the breaking point, a thunderous crashing sound exploded, signaling that the last thin defense had been crushed. The wooden window frame and clouded glass were torn inward, sending sharp fragments flying as the storm and rain blew in violently. With that bone-chilling air, the true form of the demon was revealed under the pale lightning. It loomed through the broken window with a massive, skeletal, and gaunt body, its gray skin as thin as paper and seemingly punctured by its own sharp ribs. Its four limbs were bent backward in a grotesque way, creating cracking sounds as it moved. Its mud-smeared face had no nose or lips, only a wide muzzle filled with yellowed fangs and slimy drool. Most terrifying were its sunken eyes, glowing with the faint light of an ancient, infinite hunger and pure malice. Without giving us a second to breathe, the creature let out an ear-piercing shriek that smelled of rotting flesh and then coiled its deformed legs to launch itself like a black phantom. Ignoring the corner where my brother and I stood frozen, it lunged with a lethal aura toward Sarah, who was paralyzed by shock and unable to pull the trigger of her rifle. Just before the deathly claws could sink into her flesh, a thunderous blast drowned out the thunder outside. Michael had fired his rifle in time, the bullet grazing the creature's gaunt shoulder, causing it to shriek and retreat half a step. Taking that golden moment, my brother lunged forward, grabbed Sarah's collar, and dragged her out of her paralysis, screaming for us to run. We burst through the rickety main door and ran into the white sheet of the storm like cornered animals. The dense darkness of the black spruce forest swallowed us as the icy rain lashed our faces. We ran blindly through the mud and slippery roots, falling and scrambling back up, never daring to look back once. The most horrific part was that the creature did not rush to seize us but began a cruel game of hunting, toying with our despair. It moved on all fours with the speed of a phantom, appearing and disappearing in the gray fog, creating cracking noises from all sides. At times it glided past our left, bringing the stench of rot, and at others it scraped its claws against trees on our right, hurting us exactly where it wanted like a sheepdog driving weak livestock to the slaughterhouse. My mind had officially collapsed, and every ounce of will was crushed by terror, making my legs refuse to obey my brain. In a desperate attempt to climb over a fallen tree, my boot caught a root and I fell into the cold mud. My knee struck a rock and I moaned, and as I frantically clawed the ground to get up, a bone-chilling air blew against the back of my neck, extinguishing all hope. I rolled onto my back in vain, my blood freezing as I saw that massive, twisted black shadow standing right over me, blotting out the stormy sky. Its sunken eyes glowed with ancient hunger, staring at me as if savoring the feast of my fear before taking my life. In the moment death was at my throat, as I closed my eyes waiting for a claw to tear open my chest, a roar of fury rose above the storm. Michael, with an effort and courage far beyond human limits, charged into the creature's gaunt body just as it reached for me. He used his own body as a living shield, throwing me out of the monster's reach, but falling into its grasp himself. A horrific cracking sound tore through the night as the creature's jagged teeth sank into Michael's shoulder and crushed his left arm with unimaginable brutality. My brother's heart-wrenching scream echoed through the black spruce forest, mixed with the smell of hot, fresh blood spraying onto the muddy ground. Even as he writhed in agony and lost part of his body, Michael used his remaining strength and his other arm to pull a rescue flare gun from his holster. He pressed the barrel against the creature's sunken, glowing eye and pulled the trigger, creating a blinding white light and a deafening blast that tore through the darkness. The brilliant light temporarily blinded the monster, causing it to roar in rage and retreat in panic. At that moment, Sarah lunged from the fog, grabbed my collar, and put her arm around Michael, who was fading from blood loss, to drag us toward the distant headlights of the main road. Every heavy step on the leaves and mud was a breathless race with death, as the wounded creature's crazed growls still followed closely behind, signaling that the gates of hell had not yet closed. The brilliant headlights of the rescue team swept through the white rain like a final miracle, saving us from the jaws of death just as the three of us crawled onto the cold, gravelly asphalt. Michael was placed on a stretcher, unconscious from massive blood loss, his skin as pale as wax, while Sarah and I stood frozen amidst the blaring sirens and flashing lights of the state police cars. The days that followed in the hospital were a series of nightmares in the eerie silence of hallways smelling of antiseptic, as I watched my brother permanently lose his left arm from below the shoulder. The surgeons whispered in shock that they had never seen a wild animal capable of such impossibly clean and deep tears. However, that naked and cruel truth was quickly suppressed by an invisible veil of lies when Chief Leonard and a group of strangers in plain clothes with a powerful aura appeared in our hospital room only 12 hours later. They coldly informed us that after a thorough investigation, the incident had been officially recorded as an accident caused by a violent grizzly bear in an agitated state. There was not a single word about the tall, spindly, deformed creature, no record of the malevolent mimicking voice, or the deathly silence that had surrounded the cabin. I intended to scream, to show what I had witnessed, to mention the blacked-out file from 1979, but the tired, knowing look from Leonard and the slight shake of Elias' head made the words stick in my throat like thick phlegm. Elias quietly packed his things and left the station for early retirement shortly after. His final look at me held a bitter understanding of the silent rule that survivors must follow to exist in a world full of the unexplainable. As for me, my mind had completely shattered into fragments under the weight of primal fear. I could not bear the thought of returning to that forest, of facing those black spruce trees that always waited to swallow humans with invisible claws. Only a week after Michael was discharged with an empty sleeve, I tremblingly signed my resignation and fled Minnesota in a silent retreat. I moved to a cramped apartment in a large city where I see only concrete and yellow streetlights instead of haunting green trees. I cut all contact with my old colleagues, trying to bury the identity of Ranger David Vance, but the psychological scar remains in every breath and heartbeat. I live in a state of high alert like someone who has just returned from the door of hell, my mind besieged by horrific images that never fade. I finish this recording as the rain begins to fall outside, reminding me of those painful memories 10 years ago in the black spruce forest. But right now, something chilling has happened. The sound of the rain outside has suddenly cut out, giving way to a deathly silence in every corner of the room. And then, 3 slow, rhythmic knocks sound at the door, making me realize with horror that the ghost of the past has perhaps never truly let me go. My story is not just a tale of a terrifying entity, but carries a deep message about human humility before the great mysteries of nature and the ancient rules our ancestors left to protect us from the unexplainable. We are often too arrogant in our scientific knowledge, forgetting that there are absolute boundaries that should not be crossed, and fences are always built for the sake of survival to keep reality from breaking. Arrogant curiosity can lead to irreparable loss, and sometimes silence is the only shield that helps us survive against ancient nightmares that have never truly slept beneath the deep forest leaves. I hope that through this story, each of us will have a more respectful view of the wild world and cherish the precious peace we have in this volatile reality. If you feel this story has touched your emotions and brought moments of suspense as well as your own reflections, please support us by subscribing, hitting like, and sharing this video so we may meet again in more fascinating videos every day. I would love to know how you feel about this story and whether you have ever wondered about the silent rules in the life around you. Please share your sincere thoughts from the bottom of your heart in the comments. Finally, I wish all the viewers watching this video abundant health, a life full of joy, and that every passing day is truly peaceful in your soul. Thank you very much for always accompanying and supporting the channel. Goodbye and see you all in the next video.